Apparently the move is king h7 here right away.
Wow, so he'll have to learn that during the break if he wants to repeat this line, because it's way too risky to play like this in blitz chess if you don't know all of the ins and outs. And we saw Arjun, he steals his first victory. It's 1-1, and for Jan, you just have to forget about that. And Benjamin, let me ask you something. As a chess player, as a strong grandmaster, when you lose a game like that, do you feel like they're easier to forget about because you're like, okay, I'll just look at my prep later?
It's tough. It's tough because you just throw away a point, right? That's pretty much what happened. He did not lose because Arjun outplayed him or whatever. I mean, of course, the opening is part of the game, but again, in the first game, he outplayed Arjun pretty nicely, right? But in this game, he just threw away a point, so that must be pretty upsetting. And the question is whether he is going to be a little bit tilted from that loss.
And Magnus said that between these two players, Jan is the more tiltable of the two. But let's see how he rebounds in game 3 here. This promises to be an exciting opening. We see that white has regained the pawn, but black has these passers on the queen side. In your experience, do you prefer this from the black or white side?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I've never had this actually with either white or black. This is actually called the Notenboom variation. I know probably most people will refer to this as the nude boom. But we see indeed that black has these queenside passes, but white has big center. And after the move queen e2, Robert, can black just set the pawns in motion right away with the move a4?
That looks extremely scary to my eyes. I guess the one idea that black needs to be very careful about is if after a4, white plays d5 with bishop takes f6 to follow, because you need to make sure that your king side isn't getting shattered. This is exactly what's happening. So, Benjamin, can black just play knight b8 to d7? That feels like the safest option.
Yeah, that looks like a nice move for Arjun, just defending the knight on f6. Also, you can potentially get some control over the c5 square, and I like his position. I mean, black has a very easy plan, just a3 to follow, b3 potentially as well. And I don't really see yet what white is going to do in the center. If you take an e6, no big deal, you just recapture with the f-pawn. And I mean, e4 can always be blocked with the move e5.
And that dark square control is really nice for black, especially for e4, e5. And those queenside pawns, they're very fast. I mean, a3 comes with the tempo. If you protect the a3, so then b3 happens. That knight on d7 can jump up to c5. I think that Arjun should be very happy with his position from the black side here, because I actually don't see an easy plan for white. He might have to stop those passed pawns immediately, like rook f to b1 and get defensive.
Yeah, no, for sure. This opening has gone much better than the one from game 1. And this is pretty impressive, Robert. As some players, they will stick with an opening even though it's not working. And also because in a match, you just play one game after another. There's no time to search anything up. So if an opening is not going your way, very often it's just better to switch it up and play a different one.
And knight d4 gets a question mark. Can black just play a3? That would be my first instinct, to force the bishop back to c1. But sometimes the problem with pushing pawns too quickly is that you give up squares and you're not able to push that second pawn. So at least by having a4 and b4, it's kind of like hanging pawns in a way, that you have your choice of pawn pushes.
Exactly. Yeah. I think Jan wants to meet the move a3 with the move knight b5 attacking the queen. In case you take on b2, you can take on a8 first. So that should still be fine, but perhaps black just moves the queen. The question is where, though, because if you go to b6, there's going to be bishop d4. So let's see what Arjun is going to do. He can also take the pawn on d5. Why not?
Oh, it's so funny. I'm just looking at those passed pawns, but e takes d5 does look like a free pawn. Knight f5 ideas come to mind for white, and Arjun says, I am not afraid of that. Normally it's a knife on f5, we like to call it, but this doesn't look much like a knife. It looks like a plastic one that you get on the airplane, so you can't even cut your food.
Right, and here we have the move rook a2 by Jan. Yeah, knight f5 doesn't seem to do a whole lot. Now, I guess he wants to meet a3 with bishop to a1. Keeping the bishop on the long diagonal makes a lot of sense. So let's see what Arjun is going to do here. One thing I want to point out, Robert, is that the clock advantage is not significant yet, but Jan has already sped up here, and that could certainly be a factor if Arjun drops one time again.
He recognizes that his position's in danger, so he's going to use the clock as that 17th piece. And something to note here is that as the board Board opens up, the bishops will be very strong. So I'm looking at this position. I think that staring at h7, staring at g7 as you point out, knight to f5 at any moment. The queen can go towards the king side, or even go back to a2 and just stare at the center and stop those black pawns in their tracks. I do feel like the eval bar suggests black is much better. I think it's harder to play in practice.
Yeah, queen b6, nice move though by Arjun. He's now threatening to go b3 and b2. And here Jan has a tough decision to make. Do you go knight b3, blocking the pawns? Well, it's possible, but then you completely get rid of all of your attacking ideas with knight f5. You can also go knight f5 here, but then there's the move b3 for Arjun. So Jan really has a decision to make here, and he's going to have to burn some bridges.
I don't like defending passively, so I'd be much more tempted to play knight f5. You might just scare your opponent. Arjun might see some ghosts there. There are knight takes g7 ideas with queen g4 and queen to the h file to follow. That h7 pawn can be quite loose in some of these lines.
Yeah, I like it. Perhaps knight f5 here, and after b3, maybe bishop d4 in between, making sure that your bishop remains active on the diagonal. And after the queen moves, then, like you said, there are ideas of knight takes g7 and queen g4, queen h5 to follow. So Jan certainly has some attacking potential here with the two bishops on these long diagonals.
I have a line for you, Benjamin. Knight f5, if b3 from black, maybe c5 for white, because black's queen is overloaded, so knight takes c5 will be a problem with bishop d4 to follow, and if you move somewhere, white plays pawn to c6, because there are tactics with knight e7 check in all these lines.
Oh, that's a nice one. That's a nice one. So let's point that out real quick. So let's say knight f5. After b3, there is the move c5, and if you go, let's say, queen e6, there is c6, forking the bishop and the knight. And if you take the pawn, you take, and if you take the queen, there is another fork, and you win the queen with white. So very nice lines there by Robert, but instead, rook b1 was chosen by Jan.
Makes a lot of sense. He's just stopping the pawn before it can push up the board. The engine doesn't like it, but I think we, as humans, understand it. But what's the follow-up for black? Because you can't push your pawn to a2. I would be nervous to do that. I don't like pushing my pawn so far ahead of the other where I can't keep them protected passers.
Yeah, no, for sure. They can easily become blocked. Maybe knight c5 to prepare that b3 push again. And in case of pawn takes d5, you can then also take on d3, followed by bishop to a6. The question, of course, is what is going to happen after knight f5?
It looks less scary if you start stealing the bishop, so he plays knight to c5. Knight f5, knight takes d3. As you point out, that still looks very nice for black. I have a hard time imagining, the black king getting checkmated with just like one knight on f5.
Yeah, no, I have the same thing. I think Jan should have gone for it a couple moves ago with knight f5 instead of rook b1. Rook b1 just seems a little bit too slow. And here, look at this, Robert. He's just taking the pawn on c4, and now Arjun has 3 connected passers on the queen side.
And if queen takes c4, your bishop a6 looks like a problem. You win the rook on f1 for your bishop. That's an extra exchange for black. Maybe that's white's best option, because I can't believe we live in a world where you can allow 3 passed pawns just rumbling up the board and survive. So I think perhaps you just take on c4, go down the exchange, and just pray that Arjun goes wrong somewhere.
Yeah, but I don't see it. I mean, after queen takes c4, what do? Do you go queen takes b4? Well, we'll find out very soon. But here, Arjun can just trade everything off. Take on b4, take on f1, play rook fb8, try to trade it to rooks as well. This looks like a win for Arjun.
This looks easy at this stage because there's a passed pawn on a3, and there's no threat against the black king. Rook b8 was played, and of course, Jan avoids it. I'm looking at the clock. Arjun's actually ahead on time, so no worries there for him either.
Yeah, no, great game so far by Arjun. What about the move a2 here, Robert? If you take the knight on c5, there's rook b1, and you're going to pick up the bishop on b1, or you're going to get a new queen. And this looks over, and the computer even gives it a brilliant move.
I think it is, because if you retreated with your knight, suddenly Jan would feel like he has some chances to survive. But after this line with the rook slamming down on b1, you end the game immediately because you can't take that rook. And if you move your bishop to, say, c3, the black knight comes into d5 and attacks that bishop to get rid of it so you can promote your pawn.
Yeah, now this looks over. I mean, and we see